Hello and welcome to part 3 of this tutorial where we're going to be looking at painting the finished model. So here's the model fresh out the oven, so that's all cooked, and as you can see I've glued in all of the plastic pieces into the model. I've also given it a quick rub down with some sanding paper. I wouldn't normally do this if this were a flesh coloured piece, because we'd probably want to retain the original colour of the clay, but because it's going to be painted a variety of different colours, I thought just giving it a quick sand would be helpful, just to try and make it a bit more smooth. So the basic principle here is that we're going to be building up layers of paint, sort of in the same way that a real life piece would be. So the first thing I'm going to do is paint a metal layer. So this is like how the piece may look if it had just come out of the factory, you can imagine. So what I'm doing here is taking some dark metallic colours and painting those initially. Now, I mentioned in the first part of the video that this technique of painting isn't something that I came up with myself. I got it from a tutorial on YouTube as well, and I can thoroughly recommend looking at the Scale Model Medic YouTube channel. He's a chap who does a lot of military modelling, and there's some really fantastic painting techniques on his channel which he demonstrates. The one I saw was a weathering tutorial, and the basic idea is that you build paint up in layers, as I mentioned. So you start with the base coat, then what you do is you mask off some areas where you want the paint to rub away with something called mascal, which is effectively a type of latex. You then paint the top layer. Once everything's dry, you can rub the model, peel off the latex and reveal areas below the top layer of paint, so it looks like the paint's chipped off. It's a really nice way of getting some very natural looking chipped paint and making the model look very weathered and beaten up. So that's what we're going to be doing here. So there's the first layer of dark paint done. Just letting that dry. Now the next step is to take some lighter colours, so I've got some chrome paint here. What I'm going to be doing is using a technique called dry brushing. I'm sure you may well know of this, and all you really do is put a small amount of paint on your paintbrush, wipe off the majority of it onto just a towel there, and then you just lightly brush the surface of the model. What this does is to hide the raised areas, pick up a small amount of paint, and that helps accentuate raised areas whilst leaving the recesses dark. Right, so there's my finished metallic layer, and looks alright. It doesn't matter too much how this looks. I mean, I want to get it looking quite decent, but the fact is the majority of this is going to be covered, and hopefully only small amounts of metal will be shown through in the final piece. So what I'm going to do is take some thinners and just whack a little bit in one of these little plastic shot glasses. I can't remember whether this is the thinner that actually melts the shot glass, so I guess we'll find out. It should take a while to do it, so I guess we're okay for the time being. So basically, I've got a metal piece here, and what I'm going to be doing basically is painting this a rust colour. So the idea is that we're slowly building up the layers of paint on the model. So what I'm going to do is rust up this metal layer here. Because the idea being that over the years the paint will have been chipped off and the exposed areas of metal will have become rusty. So I'm going to add a layer of rust. We'll then mask off the areas where we don't want the paint to be, paint up all our base coats of paint, and then peel off the mask, revealing the rust underneath. So I've got all of these weathering powders. And the way you use these is you take a varnish, so in this case it's a Humble matte coat, and you mix them with the matte coat, and that basically creates for you a rust coloured paint. So there's my rust there. I'm just going to use a small piece of plastic to take some of the varnish just going to thin down that varnish with a touch of thinner, and then mix in some of the weathering powder. So what I'm going to try and do is add rust to the areas that you may imagine paint would have been scraped away from over the lifetime of the piece. So I think the nose and the bridge of the nose is probably a fair bet straight away. Some wax some there, maybe the eyebrows too. And as with painting the metal layer, this is just going to be a exercise in slowly building up layers to get the desired effect. Now, the good thing with this is because you've got a varnish base, you can take some thinner and just re-liquefy the paint. So can see there the thinner is just making that run, so you can sort of extend the lifetime of your paint as you go. Now, one key element to this technique is the fact that we're using alternate types of paint. So the base layer, the metal layer that I've painted, was done with acrylic paints, but the rust layer, because it's using what's effectively an enamel base, a varnish, that's a different type of paint. So when I use the thinner on the rust layer, it doesn't affect the lower acrylic layer, and that's key, because if you were to try and use the thinner on a layer that was also an enamel or something else that was thinned by solvents, you would find that the paint would also run and the two layers of paint would mix together. So it's important to make sure that you use different types of paints for the different layers of the painting technique. So let's continue to paint the rust layer there. I've got a variety of different types of rust powder there. There's about 3 or 4 different shades, so I'm just trying to get a degree of variation here. As you can see, I'm using a feathered brush to do that. And I'm also taking out the small motor section there, which we embedded in the head in the earlier video, just giving that a coat of rust and paint as well. Again, trying to keep that just enough variation to make it look real. You don't want to make it look too regular. I want to try and randomise it a bit. So there's my finished rust layer. I've probably got a bit OTT on this. I mean, I wanted to have some of the metal showing through, and you can see more coming through than perhaps is apparent on the video there. Nevertheless, looks nice and rusted. There's the motor section on the top of the head there. Again, looking pretty good, I think. So I'm now ready for the next stage. So what I'm doing here is using some mascol, which is a masking agent. Basically seems like latex to me. I'm using a sponge to put it on. That just gives you a bit of a random sort of texture to it. And where the mascol goes, that's where the paint's going to chip off when we're done. So I'm just doing that in a sort of a random fashion and trying to make sure it's not too regular. Just dabbing that all over the model there. Just giving it a quick blast to the hairdryer to dry it. This works for paint as well, so I do this quite a lot just to speed things up. Right, so the original model was blue, so I think I'm going to try and use a green here just to give it a bit of variety. And remember, as I said before, it's important to use acrylic paint for the top layer. The key to this, I've found, is that lighter colours tend to look better with the rust showing through. If you have dark colours, because the rust itself is quite dark, it doesn't tend to show up quite as well as you might like, and you do want that contrast so you can see the areas where the paint's chipped off. So yeah, I've chosen a quite bright green here. I'm just covering the entire model bit. And to add a bit of variety, I'm just giving some of the panels a coat of red paint instead, same as I had on the previous model really. Just give me a quick blast of the hairdryer there just to dry everything quickly. Okay, so this is the basic idea of the technique, and I really like this. I think this is quite a cool little thing. So yeah, you rub the model with your thumb, and as you can see, where the latex is, it starts peeling off, and you get a nice sort of random and natural looking pattern where the latex peels off. Makes it look like the paint itself has chipped off. So the basic principle here is just go over the entire model, rub away the latex where you've put it, and that should leave you with a nice chipped paint look, which you can then add further weathering to blend together. As mentioned before, you can thin down the varnish and the rust colours using a thinner, and you can. The cool thing is here is you can continue to do that because the layer that we've added on top of the varnish is an acrylic layer. It's not going to be affected by the thinners too much. So what the thinners allow you to do is reactivate the rust layer below the acrylic layer. And as you can see, I'm streaking it down there, and this has the really nice effect of making it look like the rain has caused the rust to run over the top coat of paint. I really like this technique. It allows you to get a really nice sort of natural look, very realistic look of rusted metal. So I'm just going to go over the model and use the same technique to add a bit of texture and variation in colour across the model. As you can see, I'm also working some rust into the cracks between the panel lines there. You can imagine as this thing has sat out in the rain for years that the rust would have run into the cracks and crevices to cause that to happen. And the final stage here is for me to work in some black oil paint into the gaps as well. This is just to give a bit more definition, a bit more shading. And here's our final painted model. As you can see, it's got quite a nice sort of natural chipped look to it. Looks nice and weathered. I have to say though, now that I've done this and gone through all those steps, I'm not sure that my choice of green was quite right. I mean, it works really well because it shows up the contrast and variation in colour between the rust and the top coat of paint. But I don't know, I'm just not really feeling the green paint. Luckily, the thinners I use are actually pretty strong stuff, so I think what I'm going to actually do is strip off the layers of paint I've done and have another go using the same technique, but this time I'm going to use a light blue instead. Right, so here we are again. I've done my metallic layer and now I'm having another go at my rust layer. I suppose it's a bit of a pain in the arse to start again, but I've sort of learned, having done some of these, that you should never be too afraid to just say, actually that doesn't work, and start again. So if you persevere with a mistake, then you know the final piece isn't going to look as good as it could. So I'm having another go at the rust layer here, and again, last time I think I went a bit overboard with the rust, so now what I'm trying to do is put the rust on but not completely cover the metal layer. So as you can see, I'm sort of just dabbing it on, but I'm leaving gaps where the metal layer shows through. So I'm going to complete the rust layer, and then we're going to come back to the masking and do the top layer again. This time we're going to use a light blue rather than a green. So yeah, just peeling off the top layer of paint there, and there's my final peeled sculpture, if you will. And yeah, as you can see, I'm just having another go at reactivating the rust coloured pigments there with a bit thinner. I think actually the blue's working a little bit more in my favour here. I find the contrast between the rust and the blue tends to look a bit better, and because it's slightly lighter, the thin layers of rust that come when you reactivate the lower rust layer tend to look a bit better against the blue. So I think that's sort of helping add to the realism of it a little bit, as much realism as a science fiction head can have, of course. Right, so as you can see, I've finished the painting here, and as you can also see, I've also added some cabling to the top of the head there. So I'm just going to turn my attention to do a little bit of detailing work here. The original sculpture had some of these sort of, they almost look like outlets. So what they're actually made from is grommets for clocks. So I think they're just pieces that held part of the clock mechanism in place. On the original sculpture, I just pushed these into the clay. I forgot to do that this time round, so I'm just going to glue some on. And here I'm just scraping away some of the paint so that the glue can hold on to the actual sculpture itself, and just gluing that in place. Oh yeah, this stuff's quite cool. It's just a spray that when you spray it, it makes the super glue set instantly. So that's quite useful. I found myself using that quite a lot recently. So there's the final piece glued in place, and there's a bit more of the detailing of the motor section with the cables. So the last thing that remains is to do a little bit more painting, just add some rust to the cables themselves so they blend in slightly better, and then we'll be done. Right, so there's my painted sculpture. Yeah, quite pleased with it. I think the blue does work a little bit better. You can see on the chin there the thin layers of rust on top of the paint, and again on the forehead there. So I think that works quite well. There's still a little bit more to do. I want to do a little bit more mechanical detail, probably on the sides of the head, and also, as I mentioned before, we want to fill up the back of the head with detail. So in the next part, we'll be looking at adding some more detailing to the back of the head, and also building a stand to hang the sculpture from. Well, thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so please do subscribe if you're interested in keeping up with what's going on. You can also find out more on my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.